family, welcome to the African Exodus show. I'm your host, Tony Cherie, here to you with another video. Before we get started with today's African news segment, I want to remind you, if you have not already, you can add yourself to my Telegram channel. That way you can get notifications anytime that I post a video. So the link to that is down below. But with that, let's get started with African and world news. If everyone caught it last week, but RFK Jr., who is running for the Democratic primary against Joe Biden, he had a congressional hearing where he gave testimony about being censored online during the COVID-19 pandemic. And one thing that was very interesting that came out of this hearing was he gave testimony about some statements that he made about whether or not the COVID-19 vaccine was bioengineered. So I'm reading from an article on Politico. Representative Debbie Wasserman Schultz raised an unsuccessful motion at the outset of the hearing to move the committee into executive session over Kennedy's past remarks on the effects of the COVID-19 virus. During a press event at the Upper East Side restaurant last week, Kennedy claimed that the COVID-19 virus was targeted to attack Caucasians and Black people, before adding that the people who were most immune are Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese. Kennedy said that Chinese researchers are making ethnic bioweapons and collecting data samples from different ethnic groups so that they can target people by race. The video was first reported on by the New York Times. Now, just a caveat, this is what they are saying he said. He says that this is not what he was saying, and whenever he got to clarify his comments at the Congressional hearing, what he says is that Wasserman Schultz was misrepresenting his remarks, which he claimed were supported by a study from the Cleveland Clinic. The ongoing Cleveland Clinic study, which looked at the genomes of over 81,000 people, has posited that people with Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry and people of Asian descent are genetically less susceptible to contracting COVID-19, but has made no claims that COVID-19 was an ethnic bioweapon. Of course, anytime you want to talk about the vid on YouTube, you have to be very careful what you're saying. So all I'm going to do is give you some articles, and you should read through them yourself, because this is a very interesting and some might say accurate claim that these illnesses and diseases are being targeted at people, specific people who want to be eradicated. That's a claim that has been made against numerous diseases. Obviously, the big one that you could probably think about whenever you think about bioengineering is the AIDS virus, which many have claimed was engineered to basically kill off Africans. Now, we know that as these things go throughout history, whenever they concoct things in order to possibly wipe one group out, it doesn't just stay within that group, it goes all over the world. But that is something that has been put out there numerous times. Many people, many whistleblowers have come forward claiming that exact thing. When it comes to COVID-19, the issue with that is that it seems to have some credence to it whenever you think about what happened during the pandemic, particularly to African people. But before we even get into that, I want to give you an idea of what is being alleged when we say bioengineering. So this is all according to different articles. This is not coming from me. The first article was Politico. The second article we're going to read through is The Guardian. So it says, bioweapons designed to kill only people of a particular race. This was dated on August 20th, 2019. Interesting timing. Now it says, a report from Cambridge University Center for the Study of Existential Risks says that world governments have failed when it comes to preparing against threats like futuristic bioweapons powered by, you guessed it, artificial intelligence and genetic manipulation. Such weapons would have the power to target specific DNA and kill certain races of people, leaving other swaths of the population unharmed. Let's let that resonate and let's think about history. What particular people have historically been sought after as far as not just oppressing, but wiping out. We know it's our people. And the fact that there are weapons that are created which have the capability to target certain races. When you know a certain race is always the brunt of violence, always the brunt of systemic oppression, clearly it would not be unfathomable to imagine that those same weapons and technology were being made for the specific reason to wipe out said people. All allegations, but it says, imagine it's being sprayed in the form of the tinfoil hat conspiracies of chemtrails. I would say not a unfathomable thing either, and wiping out certain portions of the population. The authors warn the technology is becoming increasingly sophisticated at even cheaper prices, democratizing the ability to harm more quickly and lethally. In a particular bad case, a bioweapon could be built to target a specific ethnic group based on its genomic profile. A biological weapon is any infectious agent such as bacteria, a virus, or toxin which is used intentionally to inflict bodily harm to people, animals, or nature. They can be used to cause massive casualties, social disruption, economic losses, environmental problems as a means of warfare or terrorism. Biological weapons are difficult to handle after release because they are infectious agents that spread uncontrollably beyond the target area. The article goes on to say, the only major confirmed use of bioweapons, and emphasize this, the only major confirmed use. Obviously, if a population is using bioweapons against other populations, they do not want to confirm this because that would fall under the realm of genocide. So this is the only one that has been confirmed. Was the use of bioweapons during the Japanese attack on Manchuria in the 1930s. However, the number of states with biological weapons programs has been estimated to be in the range of 16 to 20. The number of states with the capacity to make biological weapons is over 100. I wonder which countries or what part of the world those countries are in. Due to the secrecy with such programs are conducted and the fact that facilities for producing biological weapons are easier to hide than the ones for nuclear and chemical weapons, it is hard to know exactly how many states possess biological weapons or to detect bioweapons programs. A further problem is the dual nature of many installations. It is difficult to distinguish defensive from offensive uses. Biological weapons are considerably cheaper than nuclear and chemical weapons and have a large effect to quantity ratio. In other words, a relatively small amount of biological agent can cause a relatively large number of deaths, equivalent in some assessments to those resulting from nuclear use. They do not require complex delivery systems, and their ease of manufacture is increasing with advances in science. When you wonder why all these scientists are doing all these things and putting all this money towards this research, and then something like this comes out of it, that kind of lets you know how the whole science community is driven. But in closing out of this article, given their relative affordability, effectiveness, flexibility, biological weapons are increasingly being considered as an attractive option by non-state actors, making bioterrorism one of the major threats regarding the type of weapon. The use of biological agents to force the eradication of drug production crops is promoted by the USA, notably in Colombia. So what does this article tell you? Well, that this technology exists, and it's up to you to use your own common sense to try to figure out if it has been used yet. Of course, I cannot comment on whether or not it has been used yet, but what I will say is that during the COVID-19 virus, people in America, Africans in America, suffered, as well as Hispanics, many of whom we know are also African, suffered unlike anyone else. So let's read through this very brief paragraph just to remind you all that overall racial and ethnic minorities in the United States have had higher rates of infection, hospital stays, and death caused by the COVID-19 virus than white and non-Hispanic people. Non-Hispanic Americans, Indians, and Alaska natives are 2.7 times more likely to need to stay in the hospital due to COVID-19 then to non-Hispanic white people, according to data from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Non-Hispanic, Black, or African American people and Hispanics are about twice as likely to need to stay in the hospital due to COVID-19 than non-Hispanic white people. So clearly, I remember during the pandemic that a lot of our people suffered in America. And if you don't remember, America got hit like very, very bad. And we know who bore the brunt of that suffering. It was our people. So I'm just putting this out there. I'm not making any conspiracies. This is just facts that I'm presenting to you. And this is up for you to read through and assess. This is why I keep continuously, though, want to say that our people, when you're living under that Babylon system, that system of corruption, whenever you're so close in proximity to it, that puts us inside of a place where we could be easily controlled, and they can easily just push a button, and that button will let out something that basically makes us the victims once again. And this is a history of victimization African people in the United States. So with that, let's just go to the next story. This just came out, and it might very well change by the time this video airs, but supposedly there's been another coup inside of Africa. This article from African News claims mutinous soldiers claim to have overthrown Niger's president. Mutinous soldiers claim to have overthrown Niger's democratically elected president, announcing on state television late Wednesday that they have put an end to the government over the country's deteriorating security. The soldiers said all institutions have been suspended and security forces were managing the situation. The mutineers urged external partners not to interfere. The announcement came after a day of uncertainty as members of Niger's presidential guard surrounded the presidential palace and detained President Mohamed Bazoum. And there was no immediate indication of whether the mutiny was supported by other parts of the military. It was unclear whether the president was at any time of the announcement, where he was at the time of the announcement, or if he had resigned. The article goes on to say that earlier Wednesday, a tweet from the account of Niger's presidency reported that members of the elite guard unit engaged in anti-Republican demonstration and unsuccessfully tried to obtain support from other security forces. It said that Bazoum and his family were doing well and that Niger's army and National Guard are ready to attack if those involved in the action did not back down. Well, clearly that did not last long because supposedly they didn't back down and we might have another coup on our hands. Now, what does this mean? Well, this means that the ECOWAS, who have been very much trying to do damage control for the international world system and the Western-led hegemonic order, well, that institution now is going to have to deal with another coup, and we're going to have to see another going back and forth between trying to issue sanctions and trying to make the people of Niger capitulate to their demands. Now, we don't know who's behind this coup. I dare say a lot of coups are not spontaneous, just like states in Africa are not spontaneous, meaning we don't have a situation like we once had where the countries were autonomous and being ruled by our people. Instead, these governments, more times than not, are ruled by proxy by whether it's the United States or more and more whether you see the other countries such as China and Russia who have influence in Africa who are supporting these countries. So we don't know who's behind this coup. We don't know whether or not it was sponsored or whether or not it was an event where the people just got up and upset with their leader. But like I said, that's rare that it happens that way, especially with the army, because you have to understand the army, the way that they operate, very much beholden to a chain of command. And whenever that gets compromised, that oftentimes means that it's an outside force that has compromised them. So we don't know what's going to happen with this yet. I'm sure next week I'll have more to report. But what I will say is that ECOWAS is very soon going to come out and try to grab control of Niger again, because this is what is really painting a bad picture of them. They're trying to give the image to the world system that the African continent is controlled. There's no reason for you to worry, oh great white man. There's no reason for you to have any second doubts. We got this. We have everything under control. And when things like this happens, this teeters on the side of, well, you don't have things under control, and maybe we have to come in and do things for you. So we'll see what happens. I'll definitely, I'm sure, have more to report on this next week. But with that, let's go to the next story. So the last stories that we're going to cover for this segment are going to deal with BRICS and Russia. So it's been reported that over 40 nations have expressed interest in joining BRICS. Around 20 countries from around the world have applied to join the BRICS group, which currently consists of 5 nations, and an equal number of other countries have expressed an interest. South Africa, which is hosting its summit next month, said this on Thursday. BRICS group, which is South Africa, Brazil, China, India, and Russia, which aims to carry more weight in the international institutions hitherto dominated by the United States and Europe, said it was open to possible expansion. 22 countries have formally approached the BRICS countries to become full members of the group. There is the same number of countries that have informally inquired about becoming BRICS members, said South Africa's ambassador at large for Asia and the BRICS, Anil Sukla. And he cited Iran, Argentina, Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia among the countries that have expressed an interest, formal or informal, in joining BRICS. The growing interest in the BRICS group is nothing new, but it underlines the confidence in the world that the BRICS have championed since the group's inception, he added at a press conference or press briefing in Johannesburg. The BRICS are not only the driving force of global strength in trying to change the fault lines in terms of global politics, they are also changing what happens in the global economic space, said Sukla. The current global architecture continues to be unequal, continues to marginalize developing countries, continues to be dominated by a few hegemonies. We want a world where our voices are heard. This is what has been reported. So something that is not surprising, obviously. We keep hearing new countries wanting to join BRICS. Obviously, the war in Ukraine has made the polarization of the world more apparent. We have those who are of the BRICS countries, and the supposed leaders of the BRICS conglomerate seems to be China, with Russia also being kind of a tag-along. So the interesting thing about this is that African countries, not that many of them have been the ones to express interest. I think there's some that are tutoring or that are observing and trying to look for the go-ahead from their colonial masters, but a lot of them are actually really reluctant, with the exception of South Africa, obviously, and obviously you had Ethiopia, but we know Ethiopia, them coming out, it's not surprising. They just are now recovering from sanctions from the international community, including the United States. So it's very apparent that Ethiopia probably is going to be looking for other people, other countries rather, in order to partner with them rather than being a part of the Western-led world order. So there's certain countries that are expected to apply. I would expect like a Zimbabwe. I would expect an Eritrea, like those more independent-minded countries to apply. I would not expect for the masses of African countries who are still wrapped into the Western-led world order, I would not expect the masses of them to automatically feel bold enough to go out and go on their own and upset their colonial masters. You have to understand, many presidents, it's not just about what they want to do for their country, it's about what they want to do for their masters, and their masters are the ones that are paying for their mansions, paying for their bank accounts to become bigger, paying for them to have nice luxury cars and trips to Switzerland. That's what they're actually trying to appease. Now, the article though, another article I want to read through really quick, because it's interesting. It seems that the West, their propaganda wars possibly, but I think probably more specifically their economic hitmen, who have been going to African presidents and African leaders to try to get more non-alliance with Russia, not even neutrality, but literally non-alliance. It looks like they might be succeeding a bit. So Russia had their Russia-African summit. And I'll read through this article. It says, but Africans have viewed this quite differently. So The article says Western foreign ministries fretting about the Kremlin's declared ambition to expand its political, military, and economic footprint south of the Sahara. The gathering is an indicator of how Russia's influence could now extend and where it will meet a friendly welcome. But unlike the previous Russia-African summits in 2019, attended by 43 African leaders, this one only had 17 in St. Petersburg. But which of them will take a prominent speaking role in the summit? What deals will be struck with Putin? European and U.S. policymakers until recently saw China as their main competitor in Africa, but now find themselves observing the deep unease. Russia's assertive return, epitomized by the presence of the Wagner mercenaries in Mali, Central African Republic, Libya, and briefly northern Mozambique. Which I'm not sure exactly if that's the case, just because I don't know what's going on with this Wagner thing. Seems like 1 second they're trying to be back in the graces of Vladimir Putin in Russia, and then another second they're like on exile. So I don't know if their presence is necessarily what it is. But it's very interesting that the support for Putin, the support inside of the African continent, which was very bold and outward very recently, has took a huge decline. And again, I think that has a lot to do with the economic hitman. I want you to understand that there are people who are actively working to derail a Russia-African alliance because they know that if that happens, particularly if America goes into war with Russia, that partnership with the African continent, that's going to be something that they necessitate. If you're talking about having the capacity to have not just dominance in the world, but create the things that they have taken from the African continent with the minerals. When you look at the military industrial complex, there's a reason why they have so much bases inside of the African continent. So they're looking to see whether or not they can secure those main supports in the event of a war with Russia. And obviously they don't want Russia having access to those supports because that would strengthen Russia. So we see a lot of things happening behind the scenes, obviously, and it's not surprising. I do lastly want to point out, though, that Vladimir Putin has been holding talks with the Ethiopian president Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. This is very interesting because Ethiopia recently put forward a petition, as I said, to join BRICS. And the fact that he's holding close talks with Abiy Ahmed says to me that there's a possibility that BRICS could welcome Ethiopia into their conglomerate. So Russian President Vladimir Putin held talks with Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed on Wednesday. Ahead of a Russia-Africa summit, Putin has billed the two-day summit that opens in St. Petersburg on Thursday as a major event that would help bolster ties with a continent of 1.3 billion people that is increasingly assertive on the global stage. It's the second Russia-African summit since 2019. The number of heads of state, as we said, attending the summit has shrunk from 43 to 17 because the Kremlin described it as Western nations are putting pressure to discourage African nations from attending it. Some African leaders arrived in Russia on Wednesday for a summit with President Vladimir Putin as the Kremlin seeks more allies amid the fighting in Ukraine. Putin has billed the two-day summit that opens on Thursday in St. Petersburg, so that's today, as a major event that would help bolster ties with a continent of 1.3 billion people. Now, Ethiopia's government has been under pressure from the U.S. and the World Food Program after they made the extraordinary decision to suspend food aid to the country earlier this year, following the discovery of massive theft of aid. They seek reforms that involve the government giving up controls over the aid distribution. Meanwhile, watchdogs say that hunger is rising in areas like the Tigray region, which is recovering from 2 years of conflict. I'm sure you should know by now if you've been watching this channel or if you've been paying attention to U.S. imperialism in general. The canceling of the food aid programs was not just trying to control the food that comes into Ethiopia. It goes down to controlling the narrative, not being a puppet to the United States. They use aid as a weapon. You think that aid is to feed hungry people. It's really to feed their power inside of that country. So it's not surprising that Abiy Ahmed made those connections. Now, as far as Putin and Russia and coming closer to Ethiopia, that could be very significant because as we've seen, even inside of the Ethiopia-Tigray conflict, it seemed that alliance, which has been going on for a while, was something that might have even motivated the West to lay off as far as the sanctions when they realized they weren't winning the propaganda war and were only bolstering the Ethiopia and Russia relationship. The fact that Abiy Ahmed might possibly be coming into BRICS, that is going to be a very, very significant event if it happens on the world stage. You can count basically us closer to seeing not just polarization, but I would even say a step closer to world war, because when Africa starts distancing itself from the West, when their most prized puppet takes that position, that is a big red flag to these imperialists. And I do strongly, strongly suspect that that would be something that would really raise the red flag for these imperialists. So that's all I have for this week. I definitely want to hear your thoughts on these different subjects. I will see you all the next week.
It seems to me that Jewish involvement then in that transatlantic slave trade precedes by many, many years, perhaps by 1,000 years, the actual beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. And let me explain. It seems to me that the most important theoretical underpinning for that transatlantic slave trade was what has come to be known in many quarters as the Hamitic myth. Some people call it the curse of Ham's story. When the slave trade developed, beginning in 1441 and for hundreds of years thereafter, people who prosecuted that trade looked around for intellectual justification, for rationalizations, for pretexts, if you will. And a variety of pretexts were advanced to justify the slave trade, to allow people to sleep well at night, for their consciences to be clear. One justification was that Africans were heathens. They weren't Christian, they were heathens, and therefore it was all right to enslave heathens. It would not be all right to enslave one's Christian brother, but it would be okay. It would be morally justifiable to enslave a heathen. That was one kind of rationale that was advanced to justify the slave trade. Another rationale was that Africans were less than human. Africans were devoid of reason, could not reason, were a subspecies of creature. They weren't human, and therefore again, whereas there might have been some moral opprobrium attached to enslaving one's fellow human beings, in the case of Africans, since they weren't quite human, that kind of treatment of Africans was okay. The authority for this idea was said to reside in the book of Genesis, in the story in the book of Genesis. Now, there's a story in the book of Genesis, and there's an interpretation of that story that allowed it to be used to justify African slavery, and they're two different things. The story in Genesis is in Genesis. It's been in the Bible ever since. But the sort of spin that was put on that story that enabled it to become the basis for the Hamitic myth actually comes out of the Talmud, the Jewish holy book, the Talmud. Somewhere around 500 AD or thereabouts, the Babylonian Talmud. Let me just describe the difference between the story as it appears in the Bible and the story as it was spun in the Talmud. According to the Bible, Noah, after the flood, apparently had a vineyard someplace, and he partook of the wine that was produced out of his vineyard. He got himself drunk one night, went into his tent, took his clothes off, as people often do when they get drunk. And according to the biblical story, he had three sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. Ham apparently entered the area where his father was lying in his drunken, naked stupor, and Ham, in an act of disrespect, gazed upon his father's nakedness, and apparently went back outside and informed his two other brothers of his father's condition. According to the biblical story, the two other brothers then came inside the tent or wherever, and out of respect for their father, they kind of backed into the tent. They would not look directly at him in his naked condition. They backed into the tent, they covered him with some kind of a garment, and according to the biblical story, when Noah revived, when he, arose from his drunken stupor and realized what had happened, he then cursed Ham's son Canaan and all of his descendants forever, and said that they would be the servants of the descendants of the other two brothers, Shem and Japheth. Somewhere along the line, I'm not quite sure how come, but somewhere along the line, somebody came up with the notion that Ham was the progenitor of the African race, And Shem was the progenitor of the Asian race, and Japheth was the progenitor of the European race. So Noah had 3 sons of 3 different races. And he cursed his African son and their descendants, and said that those descendants would be the slaves, the servants of the Asian branch of the family, and also the European branch of the family forever. And that's as far as the biblical story goes. The Talmud, which of course, my understanding of the Talmud, I'm no expert in the Talmud, but my understanding is that the Talmud consists of interpretations, what they call glosses, on various biblical stories. And these glosses or interpretations or spins are supposed to give people who subscribe to the Judaic religion a sort of an authoritative guide as to how to interpret the biblical stories and whatnot. So what the Talmud did then, the Talmud came along, the Babylonian Talmud, around about 500 or so AD, and proceeded to spin this biblical story for reasons that are unknown to me. But Ham, again, was said to be the progenitor of the African race. Now, interestingly enough, I've read someplace that early Christians also accepted this notion of Ham being some sort of progenitor of the African race. But apparently, in the Christian tradition, the kind of, overtly racist implications of that fact didn't develop in the same way as it developed in the Judaic tradition. According to the Talmud, Ham was the original African, and when God, through Noah, cursed Ham and his son Canaan and all his descendants, he was in fact cursing the African race. Now, this was the unique new element to the story that the Talmud originated. That the curse on Ham and Canaan was not only a curse on an individual and his family, but it was a curse on a race. So here, this is the contribution then of the Talmud. That God, through Noah, cursed the African race. And the Talmud proceeded to embellish the story in the most delightful, should I say, ways. For example, the Talmud said that there was ample proof that God was in fact cursing the African race. It said, for example, that because Ham had gazed upon Noah's nakedness in the dark of night, that the African race was henceforth turned black, so that the blackness of the African became a sort of a visible indication of that curse. Now, these Jewish rabbis, the sages, they call them, wise men who put together this Talmud, they actually invented. I mean, they sort of elaborated on the biblical story. It's like a jazz musician who improvises. Well, they improvised on the story. They did a whole elaborate improvisation in the story, and somehow, Lord knows how come, but they came up with the notion that Ham, when he went into that tent and looked upon his naked father Noah, that Ham buggered his father. He had anal intercourse with his father. And because he had anal intercourse with his father, that's the reason, and here I'm citing black men, that's the reason why part of the curse was to give black men large sexual organs. So all of this was part of the curse. The black skin, the big eyes, even the kinky hair too, big sexual organs, all of it. So, as amazing as this may seem, this transpired 1,000 years before the beginnings of the transatlantic slave trade. And when the slave trade came into being, this notion of the Hamitic curse was revived, and it became, both for Jews and for Christians, it became the most pervasive of all the attempts to rationalize that slave trade. Let me quote the exact words of Harold Bachman, lest you suspect that I'm making this up. I'm quoting here from Harold Bachman, the dissertation I mentioned a minute ago, The Ebb and Flow of History. Quote, "There is no denying," this is on page 34 in case anybody who has the book feels like reading along with me. I know several of you have the book on it. This is on page 34 in the middle of the page. Second new paragraph. "There is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source," and listen to how unequivocal he is here. It was the first, the very first. In other words, this is Bachman from the Simon Wiesenthal Center acknowledging But the Talmud was the place that invented the story of the Hamitic curse. There is no denying that the Babylonian Talmud was the first source to read a Negrophobic content into the episode. Here he is referring to the episode of Ham looking upon his father's nakedness. Ham is told by his outraged father that because you have abused me in the darkness of the night, your children shall be born black and ugly. This is in the Talmud. Because you have twisted your head to cause me embarrassment, they shall have kinky hair and red eyes. So if you ever wondered about the origin of the kinky hair and the red eyes of black folk, here you have it. Because your lips jested at my exposure, theirs shall swell. That's why black folks have thick lips. And because you neglected my nakedness, they, that is your children, the children of Ham and Canaan, they shall go naked with their shamefully elongated male members exposed for all to see. So there you have the origin of a whole variety of stereotypes pertaining to Africa. So the Hamitic myth then is where you really have to begin, in terms of a discussion of the Jewish role in the slave trade. They provided the rationale par excellence for the prosecution of that slave trade.